Hey there and welcome. Rian Doris here, and I am the co-founder and CEO of the Flow Research Collective, along with my partner, 4 times New York Times bestselling author Steven Kotler, who you've likely seen on Joe Rogan. Maybe you've read Steven's articles in the Harvard Business Review or Time Magazine. And today we're going to be talking about the 3 principles of becoming a high flow strategist and unlocking the potential to achieve bigger results within the chaos and uncertainty that we're facing right now. Bigger results than most people are even able to achieve in the best of times. Because the difference between the people who are beaten down by the volatility in the markets, the chaos caused by global conflict, and the increasing sense of division and unrest across the world, and those who transcend these challenges and utilize them to thrive, ultimately comes down to the strategy that they follow and how effectively they can execute that strategy. And in this short training, I'm going to give you a blueprint for developing your own high flow strategy and executing on it faster and easier than you ever thought possible. And I want to start by talking about the difference between a high flow and a low flow strategy. At a basic level, your strategy for yourself, your life, your team, or your organization is simply the answer to the questions, what am I going to do and how am I going to do it? And what's interesting is that there are clear principles and traits that distinguish a high flow strategy from a low flow strategy. The things that certain people, teams, and organizations decide to do and how they decide to do them result in more flow and accomplishment and success, regardless of whether there are adverse external conditions. Now, what a high flow strategy does is it regulates the challenge skills balance across yourself and across a group that you may be working within. It results in alignment between yourself and the group and clear goals for everyone within a group. And it allows for autonomy because it's a simple and streamlined approach to effectiveness, which we're going to be talking about more in a minute. It also means that feedback can be gathered effectively because there's coherence across everybody. And it means chaos, overwhelm, and cognitive load are reduced and shared goals are able to emerge. But these things are only possible when we have a high flow strategy. And whether you work on your own or you work on a team, you're going to want a high flow strategy, either for yourself or for your organization. Now, let's talk about the low flow strategist. The low flow strategist has a strategy that looks like this visual. Focus is fragmented. It's dispersed across multiple directions. They're fighting multiple battles at the same time on multiple fronts, going a mile wide and an inch deep. And this piecemeal strategy diffuses progress, amplifies complexity, and decreases motivation, all of which reduce flow and all of which reduce your ability to thrive amidst uncertainty and volatility. The high flow strategist, on the other hand, is a master of galvanizing resources, their own resources and others, around a single priority for effortless focus. Everyone, including the high flow strategist themselves, is pointed at a North Star, rowing in one direction with maximal efficiency. And arguably the most important principle to understand if you want to become a high flow strategist is the balance between the drivers of exploration and exploitation. The thing is, all adaptive organisms face a foundational trade-off. On one hand, we have the desire to take action to achieve a known outcome. This is known as exploitation. On the other hand, we have a desire to sample lesser known or even unknown options in search of something better. And this is known as exploration. And high flow strategy at its core is about navigating this constant trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So what we want to do is help you discover whether you're an explorer or an exploiter. And we want to give you tools to improve your ability in each of these domains. Now, just a brief tangent here before we continue. When I use the word exploitation in this training, I'm using it in a positive context, which means to make full use of and derive a benefit from something. I understand and appreciate the fact that the word exploit has other connotations and associations, but I'm using it in a literal sense based on the literature here. And the reason I want to make this distinction is that the bulk of what I'm going to share today focuses on the exploitation side of the conversation. Because this is where people, including yourself, tend to underemphasize. Irrespective of personality, humans have a tendency to overexplore new opportunities while underexploiting existing ones. And this is why so many serial entrepreneurs build a business to a modest or even mild level of success, only to abandon ship and start something new without ever knowing what they could have achieved with a little more grit and persistence. It's why people hop from shiny new skill to shiny new skill without ever developing true competency in a given domain. It's even why people will abandon good relationships in favor of a new and exciting partner instead of doing the work required to achieve long-lasting companionship and deep compatibility with their current partner. And I'm going to explain exactly why this is in a moment. But first, I want to tell you a quick story about Steve Jobs because it illustrates the degree to which he was fantastic at both exploration and exploitation. And it also illustrates why it's so important to get the balance right between these two modes. So when Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, it was on the brink of failure. During the final quarter of 1996, Apple's sales had plummeted 30%. In fact, things were so bad, Fortune magazine ran a story at the time where they said, Apple Computer, Silicon Valley's paragon of dysfunctional management and fumbled techno dreams, is in crisis mode, scrambling in slow motion to deal with imploding sales, a floundering technology strategy, and a hemorrhaging brand name. Now, when Jobs got back in the saddle as the CEO, one of his first goals was to review Apple's sprawling product line. What he found was that Apple was producing multiple versions of the same product to satisfy requests from different retailers. For example, they were producing almost a dozen variations of the Macintosh computer. When he asked his management team, which product should I tell my friends about, their answers revealed uncertainty and disorganization. They didn't even know what product to recommend to a friend. So what Jobs did was reduce the number of Apple products drastically. In fact, he ended up slicing down the number of products by almost 70%. Ultimately stripping it down to just 4 products. A year after he did this and executed this strategy, Apple went from losing $1.4 billion to turning a $300 million profit. What happened after that? Well, Apple became the most valuable company the world has ever seen. And the point is that for Jobs, deciding what not to do was as important as deciding what to do. In other words, exploiting and making full advantage of a known opportunity is as important as exploration. And it was thanks to Jobs' understanding of strategy that he was able to pull this off. The fact that he understood the power of exploitation and sticking to a single proven course of action without allowing distractions or new ideas to get in the way. This is what produced the bedrock of Apple's success. And if you want to become a high flow leader and a high flow operator, you need to be able to master both exploration and exploitation. You need to know when to exploit the knowns and double down on what's already working, and when to explore unknowns and open yourself up to new frontiers of possibility. More importantly, you need to learn how to counterbalance these two forces so that you can move faster, easier, and more predictably toward the goals you've set for yourself or your team, which is exactly what we're going to be covering today. And to understand how to successfully counterbalance these forces, we first need to understand the question. And it is, why do we tend to overexplore in the first place? Why is it that most humans, regardless of their profession or personality, tend to overexplore new opportunities, chasing shiny objects while underexploiting existing ones, failing to follow through? Well, one of the reasons is neurobiological. We're actually wired for exploration and even complication. Every time we start something new or chase another shiny object, this novelty-seeking behavior is rewarded by a hit of the D word, dopamine. Evidence shows that novel stimuli excite dopamine neurons and activate brain regions receiving dopaminergic input. And what this means in simpler terms is that developing and executing on a high flow strategy means going against our evolutionary hardwiring to chase after shiny objects and distractions. But there's a second reason why we tend to overexplore, and this one is a psychological reason. It's that, quite simply, things are more complex than we think. At first, your strategy seems simple. It's just 4 products, or just 1 book to write, or a simple whole food diet, or a small handful of positive habits. How complex could one of those things be? They all sound totally reasonable, but hiding on the other side of the apparent simplicity, an invisible force waits to derail even the smartest and most driven individuals from their journey. And you need to be aware of what this is. This is something Chris Parnan, a professor of computer science at the North Carolina State University, labels the forest of complexity. Even though your strategy, what you're setting out to do, may seem simple on the outset, it's more complex than you can imagine because strategies are fractal. Every marketing channel you intend to pursue, every line of code you intend to write, every project or goal that you want to take on cascades into an endless array of possible directions, decisions, and subtasks. And if you allow yourself to get pulled in too deeply into a fractal task, you may never leave the forest of complexity. Unfortunately, this is what happens to the vast majority of people today. Even though it may seem like your strategy is simple and straightforward on the outset on day one, there's a simple and deceptive reason why you can get lost in this forest. And it's that strategies are fractal. Every aspect of your strategy, your product or your customer avatar, or the workout plan you're wanting to pursue, or the hiring of that employee you need, or the writing of that book can cascade into endless variations of possible directions to worry about. If you get too far drawn into a fractal task, then you may never leave the forest of complexity. And unfortunately, this is what happens to many of us. We grossly underestimate the complexity that lies buried within a deceptively simple seeming strategy or task, because our strategies are like kaleidoscopes. They seem simple, but as you move toward them, unending layers of complexity begin to emerge. That complexity absorbs bandwidth, it heightens stress, it decreases alignment, and it ultimately ends up blocking flow. So what we need to do to mitigate this is three things. First, we want to simplify our strategy with Occam's razor. Then we're going to apply the will it make the boat go faster filter to decrease drag and cognitive load. And finally, to help you build up the muscle of exploitation, because you're likely strong and exploring already, we're going to show you how to get your flow from the right sources to avoid the pull of shiny objects and of irrelevant opportunities. So let's start with Occam's razor, which is also known as the law of economy. This is a principle from philosopher William of Ockham, who stated, plurality should not be posited without necessity. Or to put it in simpler terms, when faced with two equally good hypotheses or possibilities, always choose the simplest. If there are two competing strategies or paths forward, the simpler version is typically superior. So what we want to do is to use Occam's razor to slice down our strategy. This is how Steve Jobs put it. Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean and to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains. And when you look at the best companies in the world, you'll notice this pattern of simplicity across everything they do. Even though what they might do seems complex, their underlying strategy and product line is often elegant. For example, the payment processing company Stripe has a simple strategy: enable quick and easy web and mobile payments. Building that quick and easy web and mobile payment platform is where complexity shows up, even though the strategy itself is simple. And what you'll often see is that execution of a strategy has inherent complexity, which is why the strategy itself should be kept simpler than you could even think. And that goes back again to the fact that strategies are fractal, which is why we want to remember the mantra: simple scales and fancy fails. Be suspicious of complexity. Now, how do we actually do this? How do we simplify our strategies using Occam's razor? And keeping with the theme here, the way that we apply this principle is actually quite simple. We leverage the fact that strategies are fractal, because a fractal is essentially just an unending pattern inside a pattern inside a pattern. And what high flow strategists understand is that every part of their strategy is fractal. The complexity is fractal, but so too is the execution. In the same way that there is complexity inside of complexity inside of complexity that can slow down results and decrease flow, there are also actions inside of actions that, if implemented, will drive results faster and more predictably than anything else you do. So effectiveness is also fractal. 20% of the inputs are going to yield 80% of the results, but 20% of the 20% also yield 80% of the 80%. In most companies, 4% of customers contribute 64% of the revenue. 52% of revenue would then come from 0.8% of customers. This principle shows up all the time in our time management, in investing, in our relationships, everywhere we can imagine. It's not just a law of business, it's a law of nature. You see this pattern with rabid populations, river flows, and craters on the moon. The problem is most people tend to think in terms of averages and bell curves. It's much more intuitive to think that half of our revenue comes from about half of our marketing efforts, or that about half of our customers get about half of our time allocated to them. But that's not how the world works. Instead, the world works in exponential curves and power laws, which are far less intuitive. And the point is that even though our strategies are fractal, multiplying out into never-ending layers of complexity, the drivers of the results we want are also fractal, meaning that there's just a few actions that are going to be responsible for producing most of the results. So we want to identify these fractal patterns, because a few causes multiply out into the majority of the effects that we are seeking. A few of our team members are likely responsible for most of our output. If we have a team of 30, there's probably only about 5 who are responsible for most of the productivity. And inside that team of 5, there are likely 1 or 2 who are responsible for most of the output. And the same thing applies across the board. A small fraction of your customers, products, or marketing spend are likely responsible for the vast majority of the results you're getting. A small fraction of the tasks you're allocating your time to are likely responsible for the majority of your progress in life and your income. If you're trying to get in better shape, 20% of the exercises you do will likely be yielding 80% of your results. And 20% of those exercises will be responsible for about half of those results. So we want to simplify our strategy down with Occam's razor and do less better. Finding those places where a very small cause is producing a massive result, a small input producing a large output. What we want to do is strip away most of the other things. For example, if we have 5 marketing channels and we dig into them and realize that of those 5 channels, paid acquisition being one channel generates 80% of your results and the 4 other channels result in only 20%, then the smart thing to do with Occam's razor would be to eliminate those entirely and go all in on the biggest driver of results. And when you do this across your profession and your personal life, when you strip out anything besides the asymmetric drivers of results, you will increase your focus tremendously and simplicity tremendously, which will disproportionately elevate and accelerate your progress. Because a high flow, hyper-focused strategy is powerful. The sun is warm, but it doesn't start fires. However, when you focus it with a magnifying glass, the same energy can start a fire rapidly. The weight of a car doesn't pop tires, but when focused on the point of a nail, that same weight punctures easily. The focus of a company, when applied to a range of products or services, doesn't achieve anything special, but when focused on one thing, it becomes the best. The focus of humans, when applied to a range of tasks, doesn't achieve anything special, but one focus onto one thing makes it superhuman. So find those fractal patterns across your life and career and double down on their disproportionate drivers. When you do this, the results will be massive. Follow the do less better mantra and you will thrive, especially during the uncertain times that we're coming into. As Dr. Michael Porter said, strategy requires you to make trade-offs, to choose what not to do. And that's really what strategy is. It's determining what you're going to say no to and what you're not going to do. Now, what we also need to do is put the second pillar of high flow strategy in place and apply a filter we call, will it make the boat go faster? Ben Hunt Davis was a part of an underachieving men's 8 who in 1998 set themselves a wild goal of winning an Olympic gold medal in rowing in just 2 years' time. And to achieve this goal, they challenged everything they'd been doing by asking the simple question, will it make the boat go faster? If the answer was yes, they did more of it. If it was no, they'd try something different. And by focusing on their performance, the results started improving. Before long, their crazy goal started to seem more and more within reach. And on the 25th of September 2000, Ben and his team won gold at the Sydney Olympics. And the story serves a powerful reminder that when we focus on the right things, we can move mountains. Once you are clear on the goals you're pursuing and the outcomes you're trying to achieve, you need to filter every action and decision through the question, will it make the boat go faster? Meaning, will it help advance my simple, clear, and focused strategy? Because high flow leaders ensure that every decision does make the boat go faster. Every new habit, every project, every skill you develop, every relationship you pursue should be designed to propel you forward and help you move faster and farther. But what's likely occurred in your life is that over time you've acquired lots of cargo that slows down your boat. You've probably got half-finished projects or goals. You've got distractions. You've got open loops, bad habits, toxic relationships, incomplete strategies that are lugging around with you. So what you want to do is you want to dump the heavy cargo now and then use Occam's razor to do so. Because the beautiful thing about the principle of fractal execution is that it also applies to the negatives in your career and in your life. Again, 20% of your inputs are likely responsible for 80% of your stress, and 4% of those inputs are probably responsible for 64% of your stress. 20% of your distractions or bad habits are likely responsible for blocking 80% of your flow and effectiveness. And 20% of the 20% are responsible for 80% of the 80%. So in the same way that we can use Occam's razor to slice down our strategies so that we can do less better, we can apply it to the distractions and obstacles in our life so that we can do better by doing less. So my challenge for you is simple. After you're done watching this training, sit down with a pen and paper and get clear on how these fractal patterns are playing out in your life and strategy today. Then take out Occam's razor again and slice it down. Focus on mastering the tiny handful of inputs that drive a disproportionate amount of results and eliminating the tiny handful of obstacles and distractions and stressors that are the greatest deterrents to your effectiveness, your progress, and your goals. Now, this brings me to the third and final pillar of high flow strategy, which is to walk the stairway to flow. Here's how Csikszentmihalyi described this concept. He said, we usually pay attention to the things we like, that interest us, that engage our skills, but the relationship works the other way as well. We get to like whatever we pay careful attention to. Because of this, a good strategy is to invest energy in things that have the potential to sustain growth, even if at first we're not particularly interested in them. Eventually we learn more about them and interest becomes awakened. And this is what it looks like during the exploit phase. This is called the stairway to flow. And this is the stairway of flow that you need to know exists so that you can walk in and persist through the challenges of the exploit phase. Anytime you're building something big and focusing on one thing, you'll have bursts of flow when challenge and skill are aligned, and then you'll get too good at what you're doing and you'll hit a plateau of flow. Now, what most people do when they hit this plateau of flow, when they're in an exploit phase and they're focusing on one thing and taking it far, they end up prematurely leaving the exploit phase. And they go back into a more exciting exploration phase to chase those nice hits of dopamine rather than persisting with their existing business or their existing role or their existing career. They go and seek flow elsewhere. They change their strategy and they reset their progress and reset the exponential compounding that would occur if they could endure the plateau of flow that they're facing, knowing that if they persist, they will pop up into the flow channel again and experience more flow on the same business, in the same role, or on the same singular focus, while also taking advantage of the compounding that occurs when we stay singularly focused in and on one thing with a long exploit phase, rather than giving into dopamine and constantly veering away from exploit and back into exploration. What the high flow strategist does here is they sit tight. They continue exploiting. They continue executing on their simple, streamlined strategy, knowing that if they persist, a new challenge will pop up. Interest will reawaken, as Csikszentmihalyi said. And they'll get back to stage C, which you can see here, and back into flow. And on this will continue. The critical thing is to know that when you hit these flow plateaus, when you're bored, when you want to go do a different business, when you want to go change job, when you want to go reset your career and learn something new, before you do that, you should not seek more flow by changing your strategy, chasing novelty, and moving into explore. You should sit tight and wait for the next step of flow to emerge, trusting that your career, your business, and your life will be better for it. Because we want to go an inch wide and a mile deep. We want to go far with few things rather than a mile wide and an inch deep on many things. And the best way to do this is to develop a visceral understanding of how flow states work so you can engineer your life for greater levels of flow and shorten the plateaus that threaten to throw you off track. When you hit a flow plateau on your strategy, instead of veering off, changing career or job, simply get a hobby. Find flow elsewhere. Don't use your business, don't use your career as a joystick for dopamine or as a lever on your flow, because that can distort your strategy and ultimately distort your progress, your income, and your path to mastery.